Welcome to Galaxy Dungeon. In these next two videos, I'll be analyzing the dungeons and world design of the original Final Fantasy on the NES. For most of the footage, I'll be using the original NES version, although it has remakes on the GBA and PSP. If you don't already know, Final Fantasy was made by Square to compete with Dragon Quest made by Enix. It features a different battle system that's in third person rather than first person, and it has gameplay on the level of Dragon Quest II. It also has a class system where the players has to choose what job each character will have. You have to choose 4 players from the start of the game and organize their classes. This makes it one of the first JRPGs to have more than one party member, but unlike most JRPGs, they don't follow the player around. Instead, all characters take up one spot on the world map, and it constantly changes by the player or automatically. The production title of the game was Fighting Fantasy, but they discovered that there was a series of fantasy game books called Fighting Fantasy, so they decided to change the name. One of the titles they came up with was Final Fantasy, and the creator approved of it because if the game failed, he would have gone back to college, and it would have been his final game. Final Fantasy I contains a new world map similar to Dragon Quest II. However, it's in an unnamed world. But it still captures the spirit of adventure that you'd expect from a JRPG. This world has many different species of humanoids living in it. The species are humans, elves, dwarves, mermaids, dragons, and a race of skyfolk called Lufenians. This is similar to Dungeons and Dragons, which got it from Lord of the Rings that ultimately inspired the RPG genre. At the beginning, you can only traverse a small landmass connected to a larger continent, but it's blocked off by caves. There's one dungeon you need to go to, and afterwards the king will make a bridge for you to get out of the region to the next area with. After heading east, you can go to a cave to the north called Matoya's Cave, which has a few supplies and NPCs. But if you go further east, you'll find a town called Provoke that had been looted by pirates. After saving the day, the captain surrenders and lets you steal his ship. With it, you can explore the ocean, but as of now, you can only dock in a gulf surrounded by landmasses. You can still travel to nearby towns and an underground city inhabited by dwarves to the west of the first town. Near the port, there's a town inhabited by elves who are shocked that their prince has disappeared. The landmass has a castle inhabited by the king of the Dark Elves, who will ask you to retrieve his crown from a dungeon to the south. He'll betray you and you'll have to beat him. Then you can get his crystal, which you need to take back to the Maitoya's cave, and she'll give you a medicine needed to revive the prince who was put to sleep by the Dark Elf King. As a reward, you get a magical key that you can unlock multiple doors with, similar to the Dragon Quest series. With it, you can get to all kinds of new armor and enter secret rooms of the main castle and dungeons. One treasure chest has TNT, which you can give to the dwarves, and they'll blow open a canal so you can move on into the larger world. This gives you access to 2 towns in the southern continent, Melmund and the Crescent Lake. You can travel around the rest of the world, but there are no ports to dock on, so there's nowhere you can get to yet. But you can still travel all around the planet. Slightly east of the first castle where you need to go, Melmon has been attacked, and there are 3 caves in the area that you need to explore in the next chapter. A plot device of this game is 4 elemental crystals that you need to light in order to save the world. To save the region and light the earth crystal, one of them, you have to enter a cave where a lich, a monster from D&D, has been tampering with it. First, you fight one of his followers, which is a mini-boss, and then you realize there are a few more lower floors of the dungeon. So, you go to another cave where a sage will give you a rod that will open up more floors so you can get to the crystal. After this, you have to beat the lich and the earth will be restored to its former glory after you light the crystal. Then, you can move on to the next region. After lighting the earth crystal, a bunch of sages at the Crescent Lake will give you a canoe that you can explore rivers with. This gives you access to a large area that you couldn't go to before. It leads to 2 dungeons, the Ice Cavern and Mount Gulg. You can get through them in whatever order you want, but both will need a lot of grinding to get through. You need to light the fire crystal and get a stone from the ice cavern that will pull a flying ship out of the ground. With it, you can get to the rest of the overworld. The only catch is that you can only land where there's a smooth green surface to land on, but you can still get to the rest of the world map, the Northern Hemisphere. Access to the Northern Hemisphere opens up a bunch of new places you can go, such as the Western Continent, which has a town called Onrak, and a waterfall cave that you can get into. And there's a hut in the desert where you can buy a bottled fairy. Plus, there's the Castle of Ordeals that you will have to complete many trials in to become stronger. And then there's the Cardia Islands inhabited by dragons, and a town called Lefine inhabited by skyfolk. There's also a tower called the Mirage Tower that you can't get inside yet. And there's another town called Gaia. The next place you need to go to is the town of Onrak, with a sunken shrine inhabited by mermaids next to it. You have to go to the shrine, save them, and light another crystal. In the sunken shrine, you'll find a slab that you can use to translate the Skyfolk's language, allowing you to get an artifact that you need to access the tower in the middle of the desert. Plus, in the waterfall cave, there's a warp cube, which you need to enter the dungeon after the dungeon in the desert. After this dungeon, it's revealed that the bosses running the 4 dungeons are time travelers, and you have to go to the game's first dungeon, the Chaos Shrine, and use a dark crystal in the center to travel back in time 2,000 years. This lets you explore more of the dungeon that existed back then and battle more bosses. Overall, the fantasy world of Final Fantasy is way bigger than the world of Dragon Quest I and its sequel, but these landmasses are much smaller and not exactly memorable. Most of this world is ocean, and most of the landmasses look like peninsulas. The bottom half of the world is one continent with a large sea in between, with only a few rivers and canals out. For the upper continents, there are only 2 of them and a few islands in between. So, there are only 3 continents and 9 landmasses overall. There is no cold region, but there are a few mountainous regions with rivers to paddle through. This world is much more like Dungeons & Dragons than Dragon Quest, as the world is full of other humanoid creatures. Also, it has an emphasis on crystal spheres, which Dungeons & Dragons did the same thing. It's also an entire planet, as you can travel from one end to the other on ship because they link. This fantasy world is built around 4 classic elements: earth, fire, water, and air. The player has to save the world by lighting the crystals representing the elements. Plus, you go beyond the world by traveling to a flying fortress. In the original, it looks like you're in low Earth orbit, but in the remake, it looks like you're in the clouds. Now, I'm going to try to calculate up the size of this world. Let's see how big it is based on reasonable math. First of all, in Dungeons & Dragons, every square on the battle map represents 5 feet. This would be a reasonable size for the scale of the town sections. Also, the towns take up more space on the overworlds than in Dragon Quest. Through this, I can calculate that the length of the inn of the first city is 25 feet. Based on the remake, I've concluded that at least one of these squares on the overworld represents the inn. However, I think it's slightly larger than that because the desert tower is 32 squares. After looking around, I discovered that it's very inconsistent, but 160 feet would be a reasonable size for a single square on the overworld. This would make the world almost 8 miles in diameter. This may be impossible, but it's about all the developers could do at the time, and from a gameplay standpoint, it's pretty big. It's 256 by 256 squares, which is actually bigger than Dragon Quest II. Also, over time, JRPGs became more linear rather than full-on open worlds like Dragon Quest 1, 2, and the Ultima series that it was ultimately inspired by, so most JRPGs are actually more similar to Final Fantasy. But having a world that you can unlock new sections over time can be a good thing at times. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Have a wonderful day.